Okay, today I am getting an opportunity to have you listen in on a talk with a guy that I've been talking to a little bit lately. His name's Shawn Trail. He is one of these kind of multifaceted dudes that I like to talk to. And rather than try and define him in my words, we'll let him define himself. So with that, we'll say hello to Shawn. Hey, man, how's it going?
Doing really good. Thanks, darling.
Hey, thanks a lot for joining me on the podcast. I really do appreciate it.
You bet.
So why don't we start off by having you talk a little bit about what your current work is looking like?
Okay. Right now, I am the visiting assistant professor of digital sound design at Dakota State University in Madison, South Dakota. And that entails teaching a range of courses around sound design, audio perception, music production, and physical computing. I'm also doing some work in the community with the local music scene in Sioux Falls, where I'm producing a record with the band there as well. So that's been really exciting.
Yeah, that sounds cool. Now, Dakota State, it doesn't necessarily ring a bell as being a big music or art school. And when we've talked in the past, you described it as primarily having a focus in computer science, right?
That's correct. They're actually doing a lot in cybersecurity as well.
I see. Okay. It seems like actually kind of a really cool spot to be sort of a digital sound specialist in the middle of a bunch of computer geeks, right? Is it as cool as it sounds?
It actually really is. It's very exciting for that because you have kind of across the board a culture that is excited about computers in the first place. And so when you get musicians working really fluidly with the tools, it gets exciting very fast that way too, because when you have computer science on one side campus and then the students kind of gravitate towards sound and then they get to leverage that interest and passion and start developing those skills around being super proficient with the computer, I think there's a lot of self-empowerment there.
Yeah, I'll bet so. That sounds actually really interesting. Now, you mentioned kind of a range of stuff that you are teaching. It kind of ranges all the way from music production style stuff to physical computing, which that's a pretty wide swing. Where is your personal voice come through on this? What are the things that you're into that you bring to the table?
Well, I think it starts as being a musician. My first instrument was organ, combo organ of all things. I started when I was 5 years old with my dad taking lessons. And I think that really became a foundation with all the drum machines and various rhythm parts you could play on it and learning leads and that sort of thing. And it makes a lot of sense to me now looking back. And
so are you literally talking about like the combo organs where they had like the cha-cha setting and stuff?
Oh, yeah, all of that, yeah.
Unreal.
So I took lessons on that, and then it evolved into tenor sax, and then because of an MXS video, I saw the dude playing soprano sax. I went to my 5th grade band teacher and said, that's what I want to do now. And then she was like, why don't you do the oboe? So I played oboe briefly, and then it like quickly became percussion when the snare drum started learning Wipeout. I was like, that's it, I'm doing that.
Oh, that's great.
So, long story short, marching band and punk bands, and then figuring out what I wanted to do for college. And I had this professor that, I finally landed in this liberal arts school that had this music technology program in the late 90s. And all I wanted to do was learn how to play jazz drums at that point and West African percussion. And he taught me into doing music technology because you could do all of that through that. You know what I mean? In certain ways, you could certainly study the theory and learn MIDI programming, and that's where that started for me. And then, long story short, that led me out to get my degree in percussion and music technology, but in the same time, I got to go study abroad in West Africa. So I got to study at the University of Ghana. That was really informed by a combination of like being really drawn towards that music when I'd hear like Alan Lomax recordings and things like that. And then also Mickey Hart from the Grateful Dead. And then Steve Reich, when I got into Steve Reich, his journey on that path. And so it all sort of like funneled into my own thing. And it really came to a culmination when I found out about Fela Kuti. All of that led me to West Africa and getting really deep on a music theory level and really studying some instruments and their social roles that way.
So was it sort of like a musicology kind of a dip in, or were you more looking just to inform yourself of their musical tradition?
It was both, and it was definitely motivated to be like first person, wanting to interact on a musician level, but then really study theory and try to understand it deeply. So I got to study with some really amazing West African ethnomusicologist, Willie Ankou, who I actually wrote a paper that took the theory from that course into my PhD. It followed me all the way through my PhD, and still, big cornerstone of how I approach music and think that way, but certainly how I approach computers, because I wanted to develop technology. So to jump ahead a bunch, I wanted to do my PhD and learn how to make instruments. I was really informed by the musicians that I was meeting in West Africa making their own instruments. So I was thinking the computer's like the grandest folk instrument of all time at this point, and we're barely maxing it out,
Right.
So that's where physical computing comes in, is just being able to prototype with the tool set so you can make new instruments, literally, in that capacity. But looking at how certain things were done, like sound design on acoustic xylophones, where they create distortions with various mods to the resonators, informed working with physical models in my graduate work to try to develop digital emulations of this using physical modeling for pitch percussion and that sort of thing. So I'm still a player in that regard, and am excited by exploring new interfaces for being a player that keeps a like traditional technique set going that way, and trying to capture all of the gestural range that is possible through that is not sonic information, in the process.
Right.
So trying to find a way to sonify that and use it in a meaningful way.
Well, that sounds like an amazing set of influences from an educational standpoint. I'm a little confused about how it is that you actually got introduced into these West African instruments and sounds in the first place. Was it something you just like accidentally tripped over? Or were you led there? I mean, you mentioned Mickey Hart, and I know he had the one book that he came out with that was very much like a, hey, check this out kind of a thing. But I think I know a lot more people that looked at the book than actually listened to any of the music, right?
Well, that's an amazing question. That book is directly responsible in some ways, because I was really curious as a musician and had gotten into a lot of like post-punk things by the time I was in my late teens, but then got like super into hip-hop, and then that led to jazz. And the whole time I sort of had gotten exposed to the Grateful Dead, and I was drawn towards Mickey Hart's approach that way with all of the world of instruments that he was curious about and exploring. And I remember being maybe 19 or 20 and going to the library to check that book out, and that really followed me. It actually, I wanted to do something formal, and I was taking lessons in various like school ensembles at the time, but then that summer got this kind of like apprenticeship in North Carolina with this guy, Sandy Blocker, who was doing a lot of West African drumming kind of outreach. And there was a community in Greensboro, North Carolina, with a lot of West Africans. And Eric Cherry had been based there for a while. He's an ethnomusicologist around West African percussion was at Wesleyan for a while. I'm not sure if he's still there, but he had left Greensboro to go there. That's sort of like what drew me down there.
I see.
was his work. And I had just been kind of doing my own research as a young, curious musician that wanted to know more about styles. And, you know, I wanted to know about it as close to the source as I could get, in my mind at least. So that was a first opportunity, and I got exposed to real players that were living in North Carolina, and it kind of blew my mind.
That's really interesting you say that, because to me, it's one of the real peculiarities is how often you will find these small communities sort of like tucked away in the most improbable places. I don't think anyone would think of Greensboro, North Carolina as a hot spot for African drumming and African music styles, right? But it sounds like you were lucky enough to trip into that. That's amazing.
Yeah, I think that's how most of my life has been, really. It's like just these threads that tend to be like dots that are now connected when you zoom out somehow, right. You know?
One thing I'm curious about, and I'm curious because some of your path is similar to mine, and some of your path is very different. And I would say that having gone through the thing of like, you know, running across a book and being really curious and diving in and checking it out, that never led me down an academic path. That always led me down like some kind of weird semi-spiritual, semi-book-fueled obsession with something. You know, I would say there was a lot of obsession, but it never actually looked like getting a PhD, right? How are you able to take all these influences, and especially when you talk about things like, you know, being in the post-punk scene and getting influenced by hip-hop, which draws you sort of in a jazz way, but also in sort of a direction towards the dead. How do you take those things and have any inkling that this could lead you down an academic path?
On one level, I think being able to go to college and study something, you know, was exciting, you know, just coming from my background. And I found places that embraced my approach and went there specifically for that. I would say that about my undergrad and my master's degree and my PhD. They ended up being places I could really grow and explore those ideas, honestly.
Did you have people along the way that were particular mentors for you?
Absolutely. Yeah, without a doubt. Huge key mentor people. And that was sort of was my approach to academia, is how I looked at it, you know, was to find a mentor to study with and be able to develop those ideas. Because for me, it's hard to like focus on other things. You know, I just get so drawn in to these ideas and the curiosities that life's not as satisfying if I'm not able to really pursue those with support. So I think, you know, the places I ended up being were like really excellent places that facilitated that. I had people that like shared everything they had to offer. That's one reason why I do it as a teacher, is so hopefully people like me can find me and I have something to offer them in that level of growth and support, you know, and can try to create a amazing safe space for that kind of curiosity to grow and thrive.
Right. So it sounds like you had a fairly musical background. Where did you grow up?
I grew up in rural Southwest Ohio. I was born in Cincinnati, but my parents had to drive there from the cornfields, basically.
Well, it's kind of funny because it seems like I've been interviewing a lot of people from that sort of like Eastern Midwest area lately. I don't know why. I shook the right tree apparently, and a lot of people are falling out from that neck of the woods. I'm always curious, especially for people that come from rural settings. I mean, that's my background too. How did you break out of all of the kind of rural traps to be able to take on something as kind of unique as the combination of technology and sort of like ancient musics, but technology as well. I mean, neither of those things are just like busting out of the ground in Ohio.
Well, yeah, I have to go back to that combo organ deal in a big way, because that was technology, right? Like for a 5-year-old, and my dad just like dove us right into that, and he was excited to learn with me, and it was like a really special thing. And then, I played a lot of computer games growing up, and hearing those electronic sounds, I think, have a big impact, because the computer game store was right across from the organ shop in the mall that we go to right after it. I'd maybe get a game or something, but and then also like my first tape. I don't know. My parents were really supportive of music. My first tape, I remember we had a yard sale, and it was again when I was 5, and we went and got Thriller, which has all those sounds on it,
right,
that are now iconic in my brain, and just all the stylistic things that album afforded, and all the collaboration and whatnot. So huge influences there, I would say, just going on. And then I have musicians in my family that have done a lot of really cool things, so it's not totally obtuse for me.
Okay. Right. Well, that's interesting. Yeah.
And I think that, again, it goes back to those mentors. So it's like I maybe was at the right place at the right time for the potential to be able to be realized, because I had some really awesome people that influenced me on that level. And then a lot of my peers too. I've had amazing peers, to collaborate with over the years and learn so much from and share and do amazing things with. So.
Right. Well, I also think that you kind of came up at a pretty opportune time, right? I mean, one of the things that can happen, and I think you see it in a lot of modern music education, is that one of the things you can see happen is for areas of study to become so completely defined that any breakthrough is like really tiny and incremental, right? So, I mean, if you're a mathematician, I mean, you're lucky if you find a new way to twist a variable or something, right? If you are studying composition, it's very rare that you're going to be able to apply something extraordinary and new into the canon of technique, right? Mm-hmm. But if you're into this combination of music and technology, and especially if it's also integrating different kinds of music, both popular and, somewhat, with quote marks here, exotic, it's that kind of cool space in academia where nobody really has defined very much of it. So you get to be part of the conversation that defines it, right?
Yeah, you can be cross-listed with space studies.
Right.
Yeah, and I mean it too. I mean, we could literally be in space studies, or I'm sitting here, with a Sun record next to me. Space is the place. So it's like however you want to
define it, right? That's great. Now, if anyone actually gets out their Google and starts looking up your name, one of the things that they're going to run across is going to be I would be kicked out of the Podcasters Union if I didn't talk to you about it. And that is that you went on the road with the, now I got to remember how to say it right. Is it Orchestrion?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yes. The Orchestrion, which was the big physical robotic band that Pat Metheny toured with for a while. That is, I mean, if any of the listeners haven't seen this stuff, you have to get out there on the internet and take a look at it. It is quite amazing, but at the same time, this was a touring rig, and I can't even imagine the nightmare that represents. Tell me a little bit about, first of all, what it was like to do that, and also what was involved technically with getting this thing operational and getting it to work every night.
Well, to work with it was absolutely unparallelable. I can't even explain how I couldn't imagine a more inspiring place to be if you're me. Talking about the overlap of tradition and innovation and then collaboration and then virtuosity and then just professionalism and then just serious but good vibes. And then like it had a real family vibe to being on that tour. It was really awesome. It was an honor. I think to set that rig up, it was rigorous. The thing is that I don't want to misrepresent the tech specs, but I want to recall there was about 100 live signals on stage.
Okay.
So mic-wise, coming back to the board, they were managing off the instruments, if that gives you any idea of how many instruments there were.
Right.
And each instrument was some sort of actuated acoustic instrument. Mm-hmm. And essentially, they were all custom made for this tour. And there were a range of designers. Eric Singers was one of the primary designers with Lemur Bots, and then there were a few other folks. They were driven by MIDI, and we used a range of software there between Digital Performer and Ableton Live, depending on what the nature of the piece required.
Interesting.
And then then if it was a more complex, large-scale arrangement, it was probably done in DP. We used Ableton Live for the live interaction aspects for the custom interfaces and that sort of thing. So
I see.
Yeah, and then Max was also used to do a lot of the custom sensor input and then converting that to whatever control mappings we wanted and that sort of thing. So
right. Now, how dynamic were the arrangements for that? Because on one hand, I have long been a fan of Metheny and his work, and I've seen him perform so many times. And one of the things that anybody who knows much about him knows is that he has an ever-changing sense of what even his most repeated songs, they're always kind of under revision. They're always kind of being tweaked. That's kind of his thing, right? How often were you having to tweak the arrangements of this system, and how fragile of a mechanism was it? Did that bring a lot of difficulty to the dance? Absolutely. A couple of the instruments were just completely proprietary, one-off type of things. They needed tuning, like there was the oil jugs that you would have to tune every night. You can imagine that problem. God. That used air over the holes for their jug. It was a jug organ. Right. Oh my God.
MIDI, a giant MIDI-driven jug organ.
Jesus.
So oil was used in that because it evaporates slower. But it still evaporates, so you still have to make sure it's in tune. Especially if you're touring as much as Pat does. So like oil will evaporate over that tour. Then there was the guitar bots, Eric Singer's invention that required explicit tuning, and every night, even in the middle song, it could go out of tune and that sort of thing. So it was a very delicate rig. The xylophones could have issues where the beaters might stop hitting the bars sometimes, right? Because they would get it like oscillating and shake themselves out of their configuration and calibration. And so that could be a problem. To answer your question about the arrangements, how dynamic they were, some of them were complete improvisations. And so they were different every night and presented problems through that every night that I had to be on the ball with. So I was off stage every night, just stage left of Pat. And most of the times you wouldn't be able to see me, but I was at the station with the software and hardware. And then I was also managing the throughput of the audio signals from the mics and going back to the board and so forth. It was a busy rig, and there were a lot of challenges, definitely. It was very challenging. It was stressful. I would
Yeah,
say.
I'll
Yeah.
bet. I was going to say, you talk about standing off stage. I would think that it would be like your hair was on fire off stage. I can't.
Oh,
It strikes me as one of those things. Now, Pat also was playing. I mean, he had a MIDI pickups on his guitar, and that was actually driving some of the instrumentation as well, right?
absolutely. So in the improvisational songs, he would build the entire arrangement from the guitar, and then he had several different pedals. He had a Moog Taurus, and then I had built several custom pedals for him on the tour that he was using to trigger various functions in Ableton Live.
Unreal. Now, the one thing I know of having made some sort of like, I'll be honest, really crappy robotic instruments, right, is that it's so easy to build things that are sort of like fragile just in their very nature, or have like idiosyncratic, like a lot of times if you're using stuff where there's relays, you can't trigger it too fast or else the relay will just get stuck and now you have nothing happening, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or if you do something too repeatedly, what'll happen is the actuator won't come back all the way and the next fire will actually go a little farther than you expected it. Stuff like that ends up happening. And so not only the arrangements and stuff that you have to do, not only do they have to be sensitive to like sounding right, but they have to also be, it's almost like you're writing for kind of a physically adept musician, right? A musician who maybe doesn't have as great a facility as they should, right? And so you end up having to do arrangements to sort of like that also nod to that as well, right?
Without a doubt. I mean, I think that's a true testament to the Orchestrion Project, is that Pat fully explored the limitations of those instruments so he could write music that not only optimized them in that way from understanding what they couldn't do, but then like making sure he wrote music that was incredibly next level for what they could do.
Right.
So I think that is a major characteristic of that project, was fully exploring what music you could deliver to an audience that needed it to be at the standard of Pat's music that they expect,
Sure. How long were you on the road with that system?
That was a solid 3 months.
Oh, wow. And how often, like, was it like every third night or every other night, or how often did the performances happen?
I think there was only like 3 nights off, honestly.
Really? So you would literally have to like tear it down, move it, and re-rig it every night?
Oh yeah, every night.
Jesus, that seems insane. Again, when you see the pictures of this thing, it looks to me like it would be a week-long project just setting it up. It
is one of the best teams I've ever worked on.
Wow,
totally proud.
So after
my butt.
So after that, I'm curious. What's interesting now is you talk about in your current work, you're doing stuff with physical computing, and I'm actually kind of surprised you didn't come out of that experience saying, "I never want to see a robotic instrument again in my life."
It made me want to go super deep. Honestly.
Oh, really? Interesting.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, because we had to build the Orchestrion project around that level of deliverable. And I wanted to go into the art house style and fully explore what kind of madness you could arrive at by fully removing those kind of limitations and expectations from the standard.
Those constraints, right? Yeah.
Yeah, and just be complete free improv with it and turn it into a true, completely improvisatory element that way.
And so what did that look like for you? How did you do that exploration?
Well, it started with, I guess, it depends on how granular I go with that. It's been iterative, and it's been ins and outs between custom solutions and commercial solutions that were really good at what I wanted to do with electronics, I guess, and music performance. So in terms of specifically music robotics, I got to work with several groups. I worked with Trimpen once. I worked with EMI, which is another group of music robotic instruments. Prior to Pat, I had worked with Eric Singer's group, Lemur Bots, as an artist in residence. So I've gotten to explore a range of the robotic instruments side of things. Philosophically, it led me more to like the speaker is really just a robotic instrument itself, and then it just raises the question of what am I trying to do as an artist, I guess. And to be more direct about what I explored on a technical level with those tools was fully 3D gesture sensing as a pitch percussionist. So again, going back to the ideas of what I had studied as a percussion performance major in a contemporary setting and relating that to more direct traditional West African influence, which led themselves to be more neo-traditional or even just pioneering in their own right, just looking traditional, looking at it from an American standpoint. But with that said, it's being a percussionist in a space, as you would be in an acoustic space, but then augmenting it with sensing technology. So you can do 3D gesture sensing, but then couple that with machine learning and, like I said, physical modeling, synthesis. So you can create a more dynamic instrument using the computer than what you just have acoustically, but take advantage and leverage what a virtuosic instrumentalist would be bringing to the table. But then as a computer musician, maxing that thing out as a folk instrumentalist, again, like I'm correlating it to various points in history with their discipline. So it was directly inspired by Pat's influence, but there's a lot of other influences in there along the way as well.
Sure. Well, I think it's actually interesting because so often when I hear of people talking about, especially the combination of sort of like computer music tooling plus machine learning, it's almost like a big part of the goal set there is to make it easier to produce good music, right? But you made a point there of saying that your focus was on putting together an instrument that a virtuosic player could use to create great music. And I think that that's actually a very different goal than you normally see for these kinds of tools, right? Mm-hmm. And I'm not sure that the populist goal is necessarily the one that's going to produce great long-term results.
Yeah, it's hard to say. I mean, maybe the melodica was that for us, but then you have Augustus Pablo or something. I don't know.
Yeah, right. Good point. That's a really great point. So I am curious about something. You can help me learn a little bit about something today. When I look at the list of your publications, it's really interesting because there's some stuff about 3D interface control and stuff like that. There's a bunch of stuff about xylophones, and then there's stuff about lamellophones. What is a lamellophone, and how are you turning it into something that's a hyper instrument, which you could help us define as well? So a dual definition, a lamellophone and a hyper instrument. Why don't you fill us in on what both of those are?
You bet. A lamellophone is just like, I guess, the ethnomusicology label for a tongue-based percussion instrument. So it's a pitched percussion instrument, and then you play it by actuating a tongue of some sort, some material that's hinged with tension, and then you pluck it or... Okay,
so like a kalimba kind of a thing would be an example.
That is a lamellophone, yeah.
Okay.
So lamellophone's just the group that kalimba would fall into, lakembe, mbira. These are all types of lamellophones.
Okay.
And so like my PhD is around pitch percussion performance and augmenting that digitally. So I explored xylophone style instruments, which are the bar, and we have marimba, vibraphone, this sort of thing, concert xylophone, but also explored the lamellophones in the same regards that way. And so then a hyper instrument is basically an acoustic instrument that you've augmented digitally with sensors and some software and firmware, hardware of some sort, like with electronic response back from input from the acoustic instrument. Pretty sure Todd Mackover came up with that one a while back. And so it's just always been a family of research that has inspired me that way, because I can really perceive the idea of combining the studio with live performance means, like what you're able to do with post-production and so forth. I just made a reference to Augustus Pablo and dub music and dub reggae, specifically from Jamaica, is big influence of mine. So the way the producer came into the role of the artist by creating sound collages with music technology, whether it be nascent new things or made themselves or whatever was available, maxing it out again, the same way I'm talking about with a computer. And wanting to apply that to instruments, just having the idea of wanting to play my instrument the way I'm playing it, but then take advantage of various other opportunities to manipulate the sound electronically in real time to turn the studio into an instrument, but based on pitch percussion performance that way. The pianette has to come into the scope of the conversation because the Hohner pianette is a lamellophone. The nature of the sound origin in that instrument is a series of pitch times chromatically tuned.
Oh, I didn't even think about it that way. Of course, right.
Yeah, and so they're always dampened, and then you play the key, and it releases the tension and creates that opposite lamellophone effect. So that was one of my first electronic music instruments that my uncle gave me that was in a rental house he rented, and the people left it behind. I still have it to this day. And so it's informed my thought process around new instrument design, lamellophone, hyper instruments, all of these sort of things, taking traditional sound production techniques and arriving at new instruments with them that way.
Oh, that's fascinating. My head is swirling right now thinking about all the different influences that you're pulling together for doing this kind of, whether it's your own music or the influence that you have on your students or the people for whom you're doing music production. I would think that sprinkling a little Augustus Pablo dub reverb and delay tones, on top of a percussive line, I can simultaneously hear it and not even imagine the process, right? So I'm thinking that your melding together of things must be a hell of a fun time. What do you generally use to actually do your own work? What do you use? Do you dive into programming level stuff much, or do you mostly work within tools like DAWs and stuff like that?
I do a mix of both, a fair amount of both. If I hate picking and choosing because I like to love all the tools. I think they're all really great, but then at the end of the day, we have our workflows we gravitate towards, and it's sort of will dictate the speed of how fast you can realize your vision. So I'd say my main two tools, I program in Pure Data, and my DAW is Ableton Live, period. I do a fair amount of Linux-based work, so that's why Pure Data is just fluid with that. And then I use Max, MSP, and Jitter a lot, and I use Max for Live a lot. And I use Ableton Live. It's this absolute cornerstone to pretty much everything I do that way. If I have to do some lower level coding, it'll likely be some higher level C++ or something like processing like that.
I see. Sure. Okay.
But most of the time I'm getting the job done with Pure Data and Gem. If I have to do visual things lately, I've been really happy with Gem.
Interesting.
And it's just been fluid for me. And
when you say that you're doing this on Linux, is that because you're running this on a Raspberry Pi or something like that?
Raspberry Pi. I've done a fair amount of work on the BeagleBones. I run a little Linux notebook just to have that going, and mainly for the Raspberry Pi these days. But that's just because that's become a little bit more supported, I guess, at this point. And with the user community, there's more resources out there. And
it's kind of ubiquitous, isn't it? Right.
Yeah, it's getting there. Yeah, definitely.
And do you use that for the physical computing part of it too, or do you run Arduinos and stuff to do that
Well, it depends on what I want to do. If I like a lot of flexible I/O, GPIO, I'll use a microcontroller along with a Pi board. So I've used a lot of versions of Arduino in the past, but I've just now ported over to Teensy, and I really like that platform.
Yeah, it seems to be like that's what everyone says now. Everybody talks about that as having become the new Arduino. In fact,
it's neat, and I've seen a lot of up close things with it because it's based out of Portland, and I got some exposure to it at a close level there in Portland when I was there. But it also has a DSP library with it, and right. I'm really excited to explore that. So.
Sure.
Yeah.
So, unfortunately, our time is already up. I can't believe we burned through it that quickly. But before I let you go, you now find yourself after all these explorations, you find yourself kind of back in a rural setting, and kind of also with a lot of opportunity to dig in. So, I'm curious. What is the next thing for you? What is it that you're exploring now that you hope to create or to use as part of the future for your work?
Well, I guess on a dream capacity, 4D audio with being able to realize the level of 3D expressivity I came to with my PhD research. I would love to explore 4D audio and have a multi-use interdisciplinary space that supported 4D that could bring visual artists and interdisciplinary artists in to realize works that we've really not gotten to see as humans yet, honestly, because it's such a frontier of what we're able to do. Like I said, the computer is a folk instrument that way. Physical computer. That would be a dream for me.
Yeah.
And to work with students right now in that capacity, I think would be a dream.
What have you seen that's come close? Have you seen anything that's come close? I mean, because you've got a long history of like spending time at the NIME conferences and the Sound and Music Computing conferences and stuff like that. So if that thing was out there, if something approaching it was out there, you probably would have heard about it or seen it. Have you seen anything that comes close from your perspective?
Yeah, there's the 4D Spatial Sound Institute in Budapest, and the works that they're putting out blow my mind. I think that would be really incredible. The Cube at Virginia Tech looks really amazing. I haven't gotten to visit there either, but I think that's pretty amazing as well. Yeah, so those two are on my radar.
Interesting. Well, Shawn, there's a couple of rabbit holes I didn't get a chance to go down, but we'll have to save those for another day. I want to thank you for taking the time out of your schedule. I know you're really busy, but I want to thank you for taking the time to have this chat. It was really, really great fun.
Thanks, Darwin. It's an honor. I appreciate it.
Yeah, no problem. Well, with that, I'm going to let you have the rest of your evening. Thank you so much, and we will talk again soon.
You bet. Thanks.
All right. Bye. Many thanks to Shawn for hanging out and chatting. It was a lot of fun. Can you imagine being out on the road with that contraption set? It seems amazing to me. But it also shows you what sometimes people go through to really do the music and the productions that they believe in. I want to thank you, the listeners, for showing up, for sharing. Our numbers just keep on going up. It's been fantastic. I especially want to thank the Synthtopia people. They've been so fantastic in keeping our podcast featured on their site. It really is super helpful. If you get a chance, reach out to them and just tell them thanks. That'd be great. Other than that, I am going to bug out for the week. We will catch you next week around for number 249. It's getting up there.